Okay, it's just a couple minutes after 5 here in Colorado, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started as people still come into the room. So I'd like to welcome everyone who is tuning into the webinar, either here in Boulder or far away. And this event is being put on by the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, as well as by the Tibetan Himalaya Initiative, which is supported by the center. So my name is Emily Ye. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and a member of the Tibet Himalaya Initiative and also an affiliate of the Center for Asian Studies. And I'll be moderating the webinar discussion this evening, and I'll also be joined by Professor Carol McGranahan of the Department of Anthropology here at CU Boulder. So I'm really delighted that we have Associate Professor Benno Weiner of the Department of History of Carnegie Mellon University, presenting on his recently published book with Cornell University Press, which is entitled The Chinese Revolution on the Tibetan Frontier, Rebellion, Repression, and Remembrance on a Tibetan Borderland of Early Maoist China. Benno is also co-editor, along with Robbie Barnett and Francois Robin, of another book that has just come out, which is looks equally fascinating, entitled Conflicting Memories, Tibetan History Under Mao Retold by Brill. So the format that we will follow today is that Benno will speak first for about half an hour. If you think of questions, while he's talking, feel free to go ahead and type them in with the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Once Benno is finished, Professor McGranahan and I will kick things off first with a couple of questions to get the discussion rolling. And then I will pose questions to Benno based on the questions that come in from you through the Q&A function. And our Q&A function also has a little feature where if you really like someone else's question, you can also kind of up-click it and it'll kind of move up the order. But I will, kind of be choosing which questions to pose. And then one last note is that the book is available at a discount of 30% off from Cornell University Press with a code, which is 09FLYER, but we will also post that in the chat at the end so that you can get that discount with your book. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Benno Weiner.
Thank you. First off, I really want to extend my sincere thanks to everyone that helped put this talk together. Emily, Carol McGranahan, Tim Oakes for the invitation, Elizabeth Williams, Purwa Gurung, and Rupak Shestra for doing a lot of the nuts and bolts work needed to make an event like this come together. I really do appreciate it, along with everyone else at the Tibet Himalaya Institute and the Center for Asian Studies for doing all the things that they do. I'm really happy to have Emily and Carol here as moderators and discussants in particular. I really admire both of their work for a long time and have relied on it as well. So I thank you very much for doing this. And of course, I want to thank everybody out there, all of you. It's really a bit weird not being able to see your faces, but I really do appreciate you taking the time out of your days to come hear what I have to say. I'd certainly love to be in Boulder right now, but on the flip side, it's I'm really thrilled that we're able to expand our audience beyond the usual confines of a conference room and sort of speak to the larger world. So the book itself opens on a July afternoon in 1958 when a group of 124 Tibetan horsemen, members of the Wongya Tsowa or the Wongya chiefdom, descended upon a lightly government outpost in a distant corner of the grasslands of southern Qinghai province. So this is part of the region known to Tibetan speakers as Amdo. The horsemen quickly overcame the defenders, killing 7 and riding off with a small number of handguns, a machine gun, some grenades, and about 2,000 rounds of ammunition. They then ambushed a reconnaissance squad of the People's Liberation Army before reinforcements were able to track them down and put an end to the so-called Wongya incident. Now, this wasn't an isolated event, however. Since early spring 1958, uprisings had sprung up one after another across the Amdo region, leading provincial leaders to declare a state of open counter-revolutionary armed rebellion across Qinghai. In response, the state unleashed a wave of retaliatory violence that was probably unparalleled in Amdo's recent history. Now, when CCP cadres and PLA soldiers first marched into the region nearly a decade earlier, in late summer 1949, this wasn't how they imagined things unfolding. In fact, in some ways, the bulk of my book is an exploration of the Communist Party's the Communist Party's efforts to avoid this very outcome. While the Communist Party under Mao Zedong is usually considered to be an institution of radical social, political, and economic transformation, most of the book actually concerns strategies of state and nation building that are more notable for their relative moderation, and it is relative, right? Nonetheless, these were policies that relied on co-option and to a degree consultation, policies that we can throw together under the moniker of the United Front. So today, in my hopefully brief comments, I'm going to talk a bit about this United Front, this strategy that they tried to implement, before turning to what happens when the United Front fails, or more to the point, when it gets abandoned at the start of the Great Leap Forward. These are events that to this day are little known outside the communities that they impacted, and they're also events that I think speak directly to many of the things occurring in China right now. So let me start by stating the obvious. China has problems on its peripheries, on its edges, its ethnocultural frontiers, whatever we want to call them. As many of you are likely aware, in recent years, the Muslim majority region of Xinjiang has witnessed unprecedented levels of state-directed securitization, surveillance, mass incarceration, and forced labor. Meanwhile, the Tibetan Plateau has been the site of at least 3 major anti-state uprisings since 1949, depending on how you want to count them. The most recent in 2008 was followed by the self-immolation of over 150 Tibetans. And just in the last couple of weeks, word has come out of large protests in Inner Mongolia over the proposed elimination of Mongolian language instruction in schools. And while the massive protests that we've seen in Hong Kong since spring 2019 may seem to have little in common with strife along China's ethnocultural frontiers, I like to suggest that each highlights the difficulty the state has encountered convincing diverse people on the edges of a former empire that they have a stake in membership in the Chinese nation. And what I was surprised to find while doing my research on Amdo in the 1950s is that the party leaders, to a degree, implicitly understood this problem at one time and were determined to overcome it in fairly innovative ways. So for those not familiar with the Amdo region, it's one of the 3 major ethno-linguistic areas that constitute what's often referred to as Greater Tibet or Cultural Tibet or Ethnic Tibet. But it also forms part of the frontier zone or contact zone where the Tibetan, Chinese, Mongolian, and Central Asian worlds collide. Today, the majority of Amdo lies in Qinghai province, with the remainder spilling into southern Gansu and northern Sichuan. It's vast, it is vast. It's a vast area that's often compared to the size of France. Its southern and western grasslands are inhabited primarily by Tibetan, but also Mongol and Kazakh pastoralists, while the more densely populated lower lying agricultural districts that mostly fan out on its eastern frontiers are home to a mix of Chinese, Mongolian, Tibetan, and Turkic-speaking communities. And although I'm going to be talking mostly about Tibetans today, Mongols, Salar, Hui Muslims, and others became swept up in the violence of 1958 as well. Now, Amdo was incorporated into the expanding Qing Empire in the 18th century. This does not mean, however, that Amdo became part of China at that time, as some might anachronistically suggest. Instead, it became one part of a vast, diverse, modular Manchu empire. And as in most of Inner Asia, imperial oversight in Amdo was generally quite light, and rule was often exercised indirectly through a myriad of religious leaders and secular power brokers who served as intermediaries between the imperial state and local society, or at least that was one of the roles that they had. Now, when the imperial system fell in 1912, when the Qing dynasty collapsed, the region came under the control of the so-called Ma family warlords. This was a Muslim military clan that would eventually ally with Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang or Nationalist Party. The Ma regime has a justifiable reputation for ruling through extreme violence, and many Tibetan and Mongol communities were victims of tremendous brutality at the hands of the Ma's soldiers. Less noticed, however, is that at the same time, again and again, the Ma's actually were forced to negotiate with an assortment of the region's secular and religious authorities, were once again granted positions and rewards in exchange for their support, explicit or implicit. Many of these people even joined the Kuomintang by the late 1930s and early 1940s. So none of this is to suggest that Amdo became well integrated into the Chinese state during this time. Actually, to the contrary, it suggests that during the first half of the 20th century, I think, much of Amdo's political elite continued to operate in ways familiar to most imperial borderlands, finding allies, leveraging relationships, and negotiating bargains at the edges of power. So when the PLA and the CCP marched into Amdo in 1949, this is the political world it encountered. One in which there existed a multitude of astute political actors who had years of experience and even longer historical memory navigating complex frontier dynamics. And this then was the challenge the Chinese Communist Party faced after 1949 in Amdo, as well as many other ethnocultural borderlands of the former Qing Empire. That is, how to transform what had been loosely governed imperial possessions into a unified, consolidated nation state. Or to put it another way, how do you convert relatively disconnected populations into a new singular political community, one that's now divided into a single Han Chinese majority and multiple minority communities as well. So, and one of my core arguments is that the Communist Party's goal after 1949 was not just to build a state, but to create a nation. And that while state building presumably could have been accomplished through force alone or primarily through force, the leadership in the 1950s realized that nation making required something more. It required constructing narratives and policies that were capable of convincing non-Chinese people, not just forcing them, but convincing them of their membership in a wider political community. And that party leaders insisted that this transformation could only happen with the voluntary participation and eventually the acquiescence of these people that they were transforming. The CCP then, as now, was insistent that China was a single historical, inseparable, multinational state. Unlike today, however, in the 1950s, party leaders, they recognized that non-Han communities often had both deep but also legitimate grievances toward the Han majority. And rather than accusing these people of separatism or some other crime as they might today, throughout much of the decade, party leaders insisted that this rift was the fault of the Han majority, and basically the Han majority alone. That it was caused by centuries of discrimination and exploitation committed by the Han against so-called ethnic minorities. This is what the party referred to as Great Han Chauvinism. Now, if the overwhelmingly Han Communist Party wanted to gain the support of what it was now calling minority nationalities, it concluded that it needed to eradicate the cause of their hostility, which it unequivocally identified as Han chauvinism. So how do you do this? Well, the strategy the CCP employed in its attempts to repair this tear in the imagined nation or the aspirational nation was the United Front. And without going into too much detail here, the United Front will probably be familiar to many as the strategy that brought the CCP and Kuomintang into two ill-fated alliances prior to 1949, first in the 1920s and then during the anti-Japanese War. And more recently, it's been making headlines as the agency tasked with polishing China's global image through such so-called soft power instruments as Confucius Institutes, for one, but perhaps more nefarious activities as well. Nonetheless, scholars have paid little attention to the role of the United Front in China, particularly during the early years of the People's Republic, when it was tasked with getting the vital support of important non-party elements of Chinese society and then incorporating them into the new nation. This is despite Mao Zedong himself having declared the United Front to be one of the, quote, 3 magic weapons of the Chinese Revolution. And what limited scrutiny it has received has mainly focused on the party's attempts to co-opt and then control non-party intellectuals and entrepreneurs. But by contrast, little scholarship has been directed towards another main target of the United Front, non-Han communities. At its most basic in Amdo and other so-called minority regions, the United Front referred to a transitional period of indeterminate length, during which time class struggle would be de-emphasized or maybe even gotten rid of altogether in favor of forming alliances with the region's religious and secular leadership. And then these people would then serve as leaders of what ostensibly were to become nationality autonomous areas, counties and prefectures and the like. Once again, these are mostly the same figures and institutions that had long served as intermediaries between local Amdo communities and the imperial state first, and later the Ma regime. And this may have made some of them more amenable to these designs than they might otherwise have been. Now, of course, this arrangement was never intended to be permanent. While the United Front and Amdo maintained the trappings of a traditional imperial relationship, as I show, from the start, it was self-consciously designed as a transformative mechanism of nation building and then socialist transformation in that order. So for instance, Zhou Renshan, who was the director of the Provincial United Front Work Department in the 1950s, or the first half of it in Qinghai, insisted that the United Front itself was a, quote, social reform suited for the unique conditions of minority regions. And he explained that by harnessing the charismatic authority of local elites and supportive programs that promise autonomy, equality, respect, and material prosperity, party leaders like Zhou predicted that both class awareness and what they called patriotic consciousness would slowly rise. And as it did, the masses themselves would come to realize that the existing political, economic, and social system was exploitative, and that they were the victims of this exploitation. As such, their faith in the hereditary headmen and especially monastic leaders would begin to dissipate and then disappear. And at this point, the masses themselves would demand what the party called democratic reforms, in other words, a full political integration of the plateau, and for socialist transformation, in other words, collectivization. And at that point, the period of the United Front would come to its peaceful conclusion. Through this process, in Director Zhou's words, Amdo would be gradually, voluntarily, and organically absorbed into socialist China. So I want to make two quick points here before I move on. First, unlike some commentators, I see no evidence that the United Front was some sort of cynical ruse that was meant to placate local elites until the CCP was in position to forcibly implement its agenda. It's easy enough to come to that conclusion if you start in 1958 and work backwards, but contemporary eternal sources simply don't support that premise if you begin in 1949 and move forward. Instead, in 1950s Amdo, the United Front was considered by its proponents to be a progressive alternative to the treatment of minorities in the capitalist West, and as such served as the institutional ethos of all work in Amdo and presumably elsewhere along the ethno-cultural frontier. Secondly, and I want to be very clear about this, just because it was earnestly pursued does not in any way mean that I'm suggesting that it was the CCP's actions were justified, right? What it instead reveals are severe power imbalances that existed in a system that combined centralized political power with demands for meaningful popular participation. So although the United Front was meant to operate through consultation rather than compulsion, as I think I demonstrate over and over again in the book, these power imbalances ensured that both decision-making and coercive capacities were always in the hands of party elites, and that they were never in the hands of the so-called Tibetan masses, who were never given a true voice or a genuine choice in any of this. Instead, consultation was almost always geared to produce consensus for the party's predetermined objectives. So to give you an example, when a new county was founded in southern Qinghai in 1953, local party operatives consulted with local headmen regarding what it should be named. However, I showed that before this consultation had even begun, the name had already been chosen by leaders in Xining, in the provincial capital. And although the Tibetan headmen raised objections to this name, in the end, they had no real choice but to ratify the party-endorsed name for what was nominally an autonomous Tibetan county. So if such relatively inconsequential decisions could not be left to Tibetans to decide on their own, what chance was there that more momentous issues would be in their hands? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. It was very little. In fact, within the party itself, the United Front gradualism existed in constant tensions with a revolutionary impatience that was deeply suspicious of practices that eschewed class struggle in favor of allying with members of Amdo's feudal leadership, as they sometimes called it. And as I show in perhaps too much detail in the book, as the decade wore on, the party met as many or more setbacks as it did successes. And in turn, within the party itself, class exploitation rather than Han chauvinism increasingly became identified as the primary impediment to economic development and national unity. And along with that, the drumbeat calling for democratic reforms and collectivization grew louder and louder, but it grew louder and louder on behalf of the masses, but not, as far as can be told, not from the masses themselves, if that makes sense. Finally, at the outset of the Great Leap Forward in 1958, checks on Han chauvinism were explicitly eliminated, clearing the path for rapid collectivization. And fuel was therefore thrown on an already explosive situation. That the spark that ignited it was the threat of collectivization in pastoral areas in particular. In mid-February, a headman from the Nulra Tsowa in southern Gansu province invited a government work team to a local monastery for a Losar celebration, or a New Year's banquet. And according to Chinese sources, this was actually an ambush. Over the next weeks, insurgents launched attacks across the region against government outposts, security forces, and infrastructure. And then the violence even spilled over into neighboring Muslim majority areas of Linsha as well. Essentially, the Amdo rebellion had begun. As security forces spilled into southern Gansu, insurgents slipped into neighboring regions of Qinghai. For those of you that know the region, the first two areas to rebel were Repgong and then Shunhua. In both, insurgents quickly took control of the countryside, forcing state and party operatives to flee for safety, for the safety of county seats and townships. In Xinhua, in fact, a combined force of about 3,000 Tibetans and Salar came together in, I think it's around April 20th, to stage a 3-day siege of the county seat. This only ended 3 days later when reinforcements arrived from the PLA and scattered the attackers. In the process, as well as in the subsequent mop-up campaigns, thousands of Tibetans and Salar were killed, injured, or arrested. Citing uprisings in Huangnan, Hainan, Golok, and Yushu prefectures, which is essentially all of southern Qinghai, on April 30th, Qinghai's party committee announced, quote, "This is a counter-revolutionary armed rebellion, a long-term conspiracy planned and organized to destroy national unity, oppose socialism, oppose the people's government, and oppose the party." Declaring that a common thread linked the many uprisings, including those in Muslim areas, it added, "Religion is at their core, monasteries and mosques are their headquarters." It was, the committee gravely concluded, a life or death class struggle. Now, as you'd imagine from these pronouncements, the state's response was swift, it was heavy, and it was brutal. Resistance would continue for several years. Most sources say it continued for 5 years. But between late spring and early autumn, security forces overwhelmed insurgents in one region after another. Nonetheless, victory on the battlefield was not enough for party leaders. Under a policy called strike and reform, once a locality had been pacified militarily, cadres were ordered to launch speaking bitterness campaigns to bring about their political surrender as well, as they called it. Speaking bitterness, for those of you that might not know, was a time-tested practice in which members of the masses would be encouraged or maybe coerced to publicly recount the exploitation and humiliation of the old society and its ruling class, and thereby arouse or maybe manufacture class consciousness and class hatred. In the process, class enemies, which in this case mostly meant pre-1949 elites, would be identified, dragged in front of their accusers at mass meetings, made to confess their crimes, dispossessed of their wealth, and in some cases physically assaulted or even killed. So if the United Front preached gradual voluntary transformation, speaking bitterness was more akin to shock therapy. By the end of the year, the vast majority of Amdo's traditional religious and secular leadership had been deposed, tortured, and incarcerated. Many of them were already dead. This included nearly all the United Front elites who had been so central to the party's efforts to peacefully and voluntarily integrate the region from the get-go. By then, a contemporary report celebrated that 731 of Qinghai's 859 Buddhist monasteries have been closed, and nearly half its 55,000 monks and nuns returned to the laity. Now, a central claim then, and to a lesser degree now, is that these reforms were implemented at the behest of the laboring masses, who now called out, according to one contemporary source, quote, "We have smashed our leg and arm shackles, the jubilant sun rises higher and higher, the pain of the dark past is gone and will never return." Rhetoric aside, however, other contemporary reports paint a starkly different picture. In the months and years following the rebellion, rather than a, quote, "vigorous mass movement aimed at completely destroying feudal rule and smashing the brutal exploitation of the livestock-owning class, much of Amdo was enveloped in a cloud of political terror and violence. Rather than an organic transformation, as Zhou Renshan had once promised, democratic reforms and socialist transformation were achieved through overwhelming and often indiscriminate deployment of state violence. And evidence of this violence is littered across official Chinese sources, surprisingly, as well as Tibetan eyewitness accounts. In some, these suggest that PLA and auxiliary forces responded to the Amdo rebellion with a campaign similar in tactics and brutality to many of history's infamous counterinsurgency campaigns. This included everything from mass arrest, extrajudicial killings, the emptying of population centers, policy-induced famine and epidemics, the destruction of cultural and religious heritage and the prescription of its practice, and removing children from their communities by sending them to state orphanages, for example. Figures vary widely, and they should be valued probably more as indicators of scale than for their accuracy. But in October 1959, the Provincial Party Committee already reported that security forces had eliminated an astonishing and frankly unsubstantiated 122,000 enemies. Now the Chinese word here, 消灭, is pretty elastic, but here it seems to have included those killed, captured, or those that had fled the province. By then, another source proclaimed that 41,865 evildoers of all stripes were in custody. A classified report produced in the 1980s admitted that in 1958 alone, so just in the first year, there were 23,260 deaths in Shanghai due to wrongful arrest and wrongful verdicts. And according to figures published in 1996 and then redacted soon after, between 1958 and 1959, 52,000 people were arrested province-wide for participating in the rebellion. And for the most part, these figures are distinct from the devastation wrought by the Great Leap Forward. Despite contemporary claims of historically bountiful harvests, by 1959, the food situation in this area had become desperate. And at the height of the famine in 1960, Qinghai's death rate was second only to that of Guizhou province in southern China. Older Tibetan and Salar villagers that I interviewed described famine conditions of really horrific proportions. One Salar gentleman in particular that I had a long conversation with recalled that he survived the period relatively well, but only because he spent it in a labor camp in another region. Noting that not one of Qinghai's regions escaped the famine, Governor Yuan later admitted that many counter-revolutionaries, so-called at least, arrested for sabotaging infrastructure were actually desperate people scavenging bits of food to eat and pieces of scrap metal for cooking utensils. In a remarkably blunt admission, a report states that between November 1958 and May of the following year, a quarter of the population of a township had died from lack of food. And choosing the threat of execution over the near certainty of starvation, many of the survivors had fled and joined what they were calling the bandits, the insurgents. Another contemporary source from 1961 added the remarkable admission that nearly 10% of the province's population had perished over the last 3 years, while livestock numbers have been reduced by 1/2. Speaking in front of his own cadre force in summer of 1961, the newly appointed party secretary of Qinghai, Wang Zhao, didn't mince words. He declared that many people have died, births have dropped considerably, many people are thin, the land is barren, and the situation with animals is even more severe. The people have suffered greatly, and nationality relations have become restrained, probably an understatement, right? He continued by admitting that, quote, unforgivable crimes have been committed during the rebellion or the pacification efforts, noting, for instance, that some units had, quote, killed prisoners at will. So I could go on about this, but I'm not really relaying these figures and anecdotes for shock value so much as that because if we want to understand the longer term impact of the Amdo rebellion and its subsequent pacification, we need to sort of get a grip on the scale of the violence committed against Tibetans and other communities during this time, even if we can't really assume the accuracy of the figures. And to a certain extent, the Chinese Communist Party would come to understand this as well. So if we jump ahead to the years following Mao's death in 1976, the new regime was faced with really a daunting task that demanded it reinforce the legitimacy of party rule while attending to the widespread violence that had been committed in its name over the previous 25, 30 years. The imperfect solution was to rehabilitate many of those, or most of those, purged during the campaigns of the Mao era, especially during the Cultural Revolution, while assigning the lion's share of the blame on a small number of troublemakers. And then when that was done, when that had been completed, to declare that the past was settled, that we should look forward and we shouldn't look back anymore. Something like reconciliation without truth. Now, on the surface, the problems that the party faced in ethnocultural borderlands like Amdo seem to bear a passing resemblance to the crisis of legitimacy that the party faced more generally across China. Or maybe they consider it sort of a subsection of this problem. So they try to use essentially the same playbook. As a leading Tibetan cadre explained at the time in a petition that he sent to the CCP's senior leadership, quote, unless rebellion pacification becomes rehabilitation, it will not be possible to restore the party's reputation. This argument proved persuasive, it seems. Of the more than 52,000 people arrested officially for counter-revolutionary activity during and after the rebellion, authorities ultimately determined that an astonishing 44,000, or 84%, had been wrongly incarcerated. Other accounts suggested the number of people punished and the percentage of those eventually exonerated were both considerably higher, actually. Either way, many of these people had to be rehabilitated posthumously, of course. The point is, however, that in places like Amdo, the party faces a qualitatively different type of crisis of faith than it did in predominantly Han regions. Within the latter, the CCP needed to reinforce the legitimacy of party rule, but I would argue it didn't need to defend the entire project of the nation itself, right? This wasn't the case in Amdo, where for many people, the CCP and Chinese rule both had never been legitimate, right? That was the whole point of the United Front in the first place, to integrate Amdo Tibetans and others not just physically into the socialist state, but also psychologically into the Han-dominated multinational nation. And instead, Amdo was integrated through violence, right? A violence committed well within living memory. Back in 1987, the 10th Panchen Lama addressed this disconnection at a high-level government meeting in Beijing. Cautioning that in Amdo, the memory of 1958 continued to be an obstacle to national unity, the Panchen Lama declared, quote, people were subjected to unspeakable atrocities. People were shot in groups of 10 or 20. He concluded, I know that it's not good to speak about these things, but such actions have left deep wounds in the minds of the people. All of which sort of brings to mind the words, at least to me, of the controversial French theorist Ernest Renan, who over a century ago now remarked that nation building isn't a large part a process of forgetting. Above all, forgetting the violence, both physical but also epistemological, that accompanies all transitions to nationhood. And to put it bluntly, in Amdo, the violence that accompanied the region's forced integration into the modern Chinese state and the decades of repression that followed have simply not been forgotten. Now, it was never going to be easy to convince Amdo Tibetans and other communities on the ethnic borders of the Chinese state that they are members of the Han majority nation. And my book suggests that there are reasons to be deeply skeptical that if left intact, the United Front could have worked its magic. Maybe there was no magic weapon after all. Maybe this is something that couldn't be accomplished. Nevertheless, while the CCP's warnings against Han chauvinism in the 1950s were reductionist, I think we can say, at least they contained an implicit acknowledgement that creating a nation out of disparate remnants of a fallen empire is hard and can rarely be achieved through ethnocultural violence. At one point, party leaders acknowledged this, they recognize this, and they try to come to creative solutions to this problem. Watching today as the CCP applies increasingly coercive and assimilationist measures in wrested border regions from Tibet to Xinjiang to Inner Mongolia and even to Hong Kong, I think, at least to me, it's clear that the lessons from its own past haven't been heeded, or maybe they've been actively rejected by the current leadership. Judging from Beijing's turn in recent years away from even the rhetoric of pluralism towards a nakedly Han-centered ethno-nationalism, I think the most sobering part, at least to me, is the realization that nation building, as it was once understood in the 1950s, seems no longer to be the party's goal or endgame. And I think this should be a big concern to all of us. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I appreciate you coming and listening to what I have to say.
Great. Thanks so much for that rich and yeah, comprehensive overview of the book and some of its key arguments. It is really strange to talk into a screen and not see people.
I know. You can't really read the room, can you?
But let me start with a question that kind of steps back a little bit from
Right.
from the talk, and then a little something that that interests me personally, and then we'll turn it over to Carol. So, I think in the book you make the point that it's important to study the borderlands, right, and not just to study the incorporation of central Tibet, and that's one of the reasons for your study. But I wonder, just in your own personal trajectory of this project, how you ended up in Amdo rather than Kham, or and specifically how you ended up in Zeko. And then, that leads to, for me, one of the most interesting parts of the book are these references to things that have to do specifically with grasslands, because I spent a lot of time thinking about grasslands. And I wondered what, if anything, the specifically pastoral character of Zeku has, what difference does that make? If any, can we think about, how, so it's not just a different nation that has to be integrated into the Chinese nation, but a very different, kind of ecological way of being on the landscape. And how do those strategies change over time as the gradualist United Front kind of gives away to revolutionary impulse? Does impatience, right? Does that pastoral character make any difference?
Thank you. Why Amdo? It's a great question. A couple of reasons. The first is a very practical one, and that's access. Qinghai certainly 10 years ago was much more open than Central Tibet ever was. I was able to spend time there. I was able to make connections there, and so you do things that we do when we're trying to start a research project, right? You have to, without access, it's very difficult. So that's just a very, very obvious and practical reason to move to Amdo. But there are also sort of intellectual or conceptual ones. And what I really find interesting about Amdo is the borderland nature of it. Central Tibet, is at least, looking from China, is less a borderland than Amdo. This really is a region where you see so many peoples and cultures and languages and religions coming together, operating side by side and sometimes integrated for hundreds of years. Often there's a lot of violence between these communities, but there's also a lot of cooperation or exchange between them. Sometimes people wonder, they say Amdo ends where the Muslim areas begin, but if you go to these areas like Shunhua, for instance, they live on top of each other. The Salar live along the river, and then the Tibetans often live as you go up the tributaries, up the mountains in the mountain valleys, and there's been tremendous amounts of exchange as well as distrust over the centuries between them. So I think it's really a fascinating place to study some of the things that I'm interested in, which are frontiers and borderlands more generally, but also the processes of what happens to these borderlands when the nation comes in and tries to transform them into something altogether new. So they're really juggling a lot of people in this area, the CCP is, and they realized it to a degree. And they thought they had to treat Muslims different than Tibetans and Mongols, for instance, for various historical reasons, and did so. And these United Front policies were extended much more leniently towards Tibetans and Mongols, for instance, than they were to some Muslim communities. Not entirely, it was still active in Muslim areas, but they considered, because Tibetans were, they said, victims of the exploitation of the Ma regime, for instance, they would be more willing to accept the party if they properly presented their case. So, for instance, even when there are uprisings, which I didn't mention, between 1949 and 1953 against the party, this had been predicted by the party by party leaders that this would happen in Muslim areas. But they thought the Tibetans would never join these rebellions because A, they thought Tibetans hated Muslims and vice versa, and that the Tibetans would be thrilled to be emancipated by the party. And actually, some Tibetans certainly did those things, but others joined these rebellions alongside Muslim communities. And I would argue that they had a lot more experience dealing with these local communities that they lived next to than this foreign entity, the CCP, with these foreign ideas coming in. So so that's a long-winded answer of suggesting that I just find the dynamics in this area really fascinating and important, and overlooked. And that's the last bit. I think now we're learning a lot about Amdo in the last 10 years or so, but for a long time it had really been overlooked, even though it's really been an amazingly, it's been probably the most important interface between the Chinese world and Tibetan world for centuries. Why Zekov? The practical reason is that's where I ended up getting access to information about. Xunhua is actually the place I really was interested in particular, because of it's just such this contact zone between different peoples. But we follow our sources, which in the end is a good thing, right? I think it's productive and helpful. But Zekko is a purely Tibetan area, or has been traditionally. It's a purely pastoral area. And when the party moved in, they noted this right away. And they divided Qinghai up into different zones: agricultural zones, mixed zones, and most of this was economic because that's the way they approach things, right? Historical materialism, and pastoral areas. And they said, pastoral areas are the most foreign, the most distant, the most backward, which is the word they of course use quite a bit, the most superstitious, and therefore we need to move the slowest in these areas. We need to be the most, there's the most exploitation in some ways in pastoral areas. But despite that, we're not going to overthrow the exploitative system right away. We need to go most carefully in these pastoral areas. And I could go over, sort of detail through the years how this worked, but I think it's important to note that in 1958, when the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward was announced and came into being, and pastoral collectivization really for the first time was on the books. For a brief period in 1956 it was too, but this is the first real time. These areas had never been organized even into mutual aid teams, into small little sort of, very, very simple sort of mutual help organizations. So they really were trying to go from 0 to 55, or even want to say, overnight. And I think that's one of the things that really ignited this rebellion. Of course, people in these areas were armed, for instance, which they weren't in agricultural areas necessarily. And so I guess that would be my response to that question for now, at least. But there's probably more I could say about it.
Great, thanks so much. We have a bunch of questions in the chat, but let me turn it over to Carol first for a question, and then I will start to take some chat questions.
Okay. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Bernard. This was really fun to get to not just read your work, but now hear you present it. And I'm sorry we couldn't be in person. Hopefully one. This
so beautiful where you're at. I wish I was there.
Yeah, we can have you back and have you to Boulder and be here with us for a couple of days. So I have two questions. I'll just ask one because I do see there's a lot of questions in the comments. And so I'm going to actually ask not the Tibet question, but a China question. So I was really struck as you were talking in looking at this narrative that you presented of the United Front and what was going on at this time in 1950s in Amdo as very different, right, from the way that we might discuss the United Front right now. Right. And so just looking at the configuration of the nation in China from the 1950s, or even from 1949 forward, looking at the different justifications for the benevolence of empire, right, that have been offered along the way, that those also have changed. And of course, that's to be expected, right? We see shifts in the way that nations are configured, in the way that justifications for rule or for policies or, whatnot are offered over time. But to pull on something you said from Renan on forgetting, the socialist state actually, right, does have some sort of monopoly on a certain type of really stark forgetting. And so with that in mind, I'm wondering, what is the place for these sorts of stories, right, that you are telling, not to us, right, not necessarily to this Tibetan studies or Asian studies audience, but within China, of the portrait that you've sketched for us of this optimistic group of Han officials working for the United Front who were not just proud of their self-critique that they had, right? That Tibetans had, as you said, deep but legitimate grievances that were the fault of the Han, right? That came off of centuries, right, of oppression and discrimination. That their ability to recognize this, to name it, to self-critique was going to lead, right, to something positive for the local community, for the nation, for the party, right, et cetera. So now knowing the starkness of forgetting and the available categories of party history, which are to kind of to dismiss this as, that was wrong, or perhaps naive might be a polite way to say it. Where does this history fit? Like, how do you tell this history in a Chinese space? Who tells it? With what repercussions and how, right? How can this particular story of this time of the party in Tibet be told as a part of Chinese history that's not just wrong or naive, right? And what does that mean to be able to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question. Where should I start? First of all, I think I should say that while the party itself as sort of an institution was very proud of, to use your word, of recognizing these problems, that doesn't mean that most individuals believed in it or not. We don't know what actual individual cadres on the grasslands thought about it. We don't really know what the leadership thought about it. It could be like any institution, right? There's something that institutions want to do, but when we're in the coffee room talking about it, we may not be behind it all the way. And it seems like that's probably the case. It seems like there was a lot of resistance, although it's hard to tell, on the grasslands to these policies. And then when the script was flipped, when they were allowed to impose this, this radical transformation, they did it very quickly. Again, suggesting that maybe there was a lot of people on the grasslands who were very ginned up for this in the first place. How do we tell these stories? I mean, first of all, these stories are being told in Amdo, but they have to be told very quietly or in roundabout ways. I mean, this is, you mentioned or Emily did the book that we just put out with Ryder Barnett and Francoise Raban. And that's one of the things that this book tries to address. How do people remember? How do they forget? And how are these things recalled, and how does it change over time? So we do see Amdo Tibetans obviously talking to each other about these things and their children and families in quiet spaces, but also in things like literature, poetry, song, and so on and so forth. So there are spaces, but they do it at considerable risk. And for instance, one man, Shamdo Rinchen, who published a sort of black market oral history on this period, was arrested and we're told he was tortured and suffered greatly for this. But I do think it's in some ways just as important. It's very important for Amdo Tibetans to learn this history, I think, and of course many of them already know it. I don't have to tell them about it, but I think it's equally or maybe more important for Chinese to learn this. And of course that's the problem. How do you find those spaces to do so? Particularly in this moment in time. I think it would be a wonderful lesson for many people in China to understand and really to take seriously the complaints that non-Chinese people have about the state, about the party, and about the majority population. And I think we can make connections to our own country. I mean, this is a moment right now where we're trying to open up space for other histories, other voices, and other to remember, right? To stop forgetting how other people suffered in our past. And then we have a regime in power that's trying to silence those voices and sort of go back to a much more antiseptic sort of history of greatness. And I think we see that obviously in China as well. How do you change that? I mean, I don't know. But I think it's important to try to remember that these aren't sort of what's the word I'm looking for? These aren't dissident voices talking about this history. This is the history of the party itself told, and the history that the party repeated in the early '60s. So when Wang Zhao was talking about these things, that was what the party wanted to talk about at that moment for various historical reasons. And this is a history that, to a degree, was allowed to be talked about in a way in the 1980s again, as I mentioned, not fully. So maybe there's a chance in the future that this will be a moment that we can talk about again if the leadership changes or comes to a conclusion that these hardline policies are not working. I'm not very optimistic about that, of course, but you know, I wish I had a better answer, a way that these stories could be told in China more openly and listened to.
Great. Well, let me start to pose a few of the questions from the chat, of which there are quite a Q&A. One, before I turn to the most popular one I think may follow a little bit on the current conversation, is about the United Front, right? A lot of it is about how the role of the United Front and how that's changed. And so one question is, I didn't realize that the term United Front had a positive connotation in the Chinese Communist Party, considering how fraught the United Front was with the Kuomintang in the 1920s and 30s. Did the communists think of those alliances with the Kuomintang as successes? So that, but maybe also more on kind of what you're talking about, the evaluation of the United Front within the party.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the United Front is considered to be, I think today, as always, a positive thing. I think they consider it to be successful in the context of World War II or the anti-Japanese war. Obviously, it wasn't a success for those that know the history. The first one that ended in 1927 with a massacre of the communists by Chiang Kai-shek. But in a weird way, the way it's narrated is similar to the way that Mao changed the story in 1958 about the United Front. In other words, after Chiang Kai-shek turned on the communists in 1927, Stalin and the leadership of the Communist Party said, see, it worked. The reactionaries have shown their true colors, and they've come out. Now we know who the enemies really are. And of course, this is trying to make good out of a very terrible situation for the communists. But that was sort of the way it was explained, and probably the way it's still understood to some degree. In 1958, Mao, and not just Mao, many other people said the same thing. They said, the reactionaries have shown their true colors, meaning the Tibetan headmen and religious leaders that we've been working with this whole time. And now we can cut off their heads, essentially, and the masses can rise up and they can implement reforms and socialism and all these things. Now, again, I think that was not the rationale from day one. I think that was a new rationale in 1958 in reaction to the uprising, just like Stalin and Chen Dushou and others in 1927 saying, look, Chiang Kai-shek has shown his true colors. Well, of course, that's not the way they thought about it earlier. That's the way they re-rationalized it afterwards. So I think there's an interesting connection you can make about the way the United Front is remembered and can be manipulated when need be. I'm not, was there more of the question than that, or is
Let's
we can come back to that. I mean,
yeah,
the United Front, I think, is well, we'll come back to that if you like.
Okay. And let me pose the most popular question here, which you've addressed a little already, but I think a lot of people are curious about how you were able to do this, right? It's a sensitive topic, it's difficult. So just, you know, how you were able to do it, and a question about your sources as well. Kind of what was the nature of the sources and where?
Yeah. I was able to do it because, you know, a decade ago in Qinghai was a much different world than it is today. There were a lot of us working in Qinghai back then on what would be considered sensitive topics. Maybe mine was the most sensitive in retrospect. And we were able to operate pretty openly, I think. You know, you don't tell people exactly what you're doing, of course, but you know, it wasn't through subterfuge or anything like this. I don't think that's the case today. So a lot of, it's not, my books just came out, but I think several other books on Ondo are going to be coming out in the next year or two. And some have already come out. So I think you're going to see some really great stuff from this moment in time in the late 2000s, I guess you call it, in which there was this space to do a lot more research and to be part of communities in a way that's much harder today. So I'm really concerned that we can't do this research now. As far as sources go, I mean, I can't go into details. A lot of it's based on county level archives, which I was fortunate enough to get access to. But there's also a tremendous amount of information in Chinese open sources, in gazetteers and other things that you would be surprised that would be published by the state. And I can go into why that is. There's certain times when people, different regimes come to power in different areas of China, and they want to, how am I going to put this that will make sense to people? Essentially, when a lot of these local histories were written in the late 1980s and 1990s, it was after the Cultural Revolution, and it's when the people who originally had been in power in places like Qinghai had come back into power, and they wanted to rewrite the history of their time. And so they published a lot of things that are surprising that you'd find in open sources today once you start looking. So some of the stuff we can still do from afar, but not having access, I think, to places like Qinghai, it's going to make doing really good, you know, on the ground sort of empirical research much more difficult going forward.
Great, thank you. Let me ask questions from a couple of Andrews. First, Andrew Frankel says, if possible, can you speak about the role that formal or informal educational practices played in the attempt to assimilate Amdoas into the PRC? What were the first efforts to obligate Tibetans to attend state-run schooling? What were responses? This may or may not be part of, yeah.
Right. I mean, I can't really talk about it in any detail. I can tell you that in the grasslands, every year you have work plans, and those work plans always include things like education, how we're gonna, you know, we're gonna establish schools, we're gonna make kids go to school, we're gonna bring teachers in, we're gonna train teachers, and at the end of every year they have a you know, evaluation of the previous year's work plan, and every time it didn't happen. You know, these schools just didn't get off the ground. There was you know, a tent schools they called in Zeku in the Hor region, for instance, I think in 1955 with a handful of students. But my impression is, at least in pastoral areas, this wasn't effectively put into action until 1958. For most Amdo Tibetans, I think, and maybe others, until the rebellion, the Chinese state was still pretty far away. Some people maybe never had, you know, if you believe Natsan Nulo's memoir, My Tibetan Childhood, which I recommend people read if they're interested in this topic, you know, there were people that never encountered the Chinese state, perhaps, until the armies came in 1958. And that's another reason why 1958 and not 1949 is really this rupture year in Amdo. So I think we need to sort of recalibrate how we understand time in places like Amdo, when the really important moments happened. In China, we talked about 1949 and 1966, for instance, but in Amdo, you know, the Cultural Revolution, in Amdo it's 1958, very clearly. This is the moment that Amdo was dragged into China and dragged in quite violently. So.
Great, thanks. And let me ask Andrew Grant's question. He says, I'm curious about the relationship between the Chinese youth resettlers that Greg Rolfe discusses in his book, Colonizing Koko Nur, and its impact on the famine that you were describing in the region. I think in his book, he refers to most of the conflict that occurred as, quote, sub-ethnic, de-emphasizing the tensions between nationalities. Do you think that these settlements and agricultural transformations were actually significant drivers of famine and conflict in this period?
Well, Andrew Grant's one of the people whose book's going to be coming out pretty soon, and I encourage everybody to read that. So good plug, Andrew. Yeah, I mean, so again, I'm going to really focus on pastoral areas, and there really wasn't any effort to settle these areas, to bring in agricultural settlements until the Great Leap Forward in Zekel, for instance. So actually in 1955, 1956, when you have the high tide of socialist transformation across China, and the first wave of attempts to collectivize places like Amdo, it didn't get very far. There was these crazy plans in Zekel, for instance, which only had a population of about 20,000 people, to over 10 years bring in 100,000 Han settlers. You know, and the average altitude is about 12,000 feet or something in this area, and you know, grow wheat and have pigs and chickens, and of course all this stuff was fantasy. What does happen in 1958 is one of these, actually I don't think they arrive until 59 or 60 now I think about it. One of these youth shock brigades, these youth settlement teams, does get sent in from Henan province, but I think it's only about 100 some kids. And they can't even get through the first winter, or they can't even get through the first harvest. And then some more join them the next year. But by 1962, they basically deserted. There's very few people left. And of course, the famine's a big part of that. I don't think they contributed to the famine so much in Zekok. There wasn't enough of them, but they certainly suffered because of it. Now, I think it's Yuan, the governor that I mentioned, does talk very early, I think in 1959, but maybe it's not till the early 1960s, about how plans to turn grasslands into agriculture had contributed to the famine, how it was an ecological disaster in the waiting, how people were flooding the cities because there wasn't enough food in the countryside, including the grasslands. So there's this suggestion that it was part of the problem. I think that's probably a much bigger problem in places like the Saidam Basin, where Greg Wolf discusses. This is an area where they're trying to extract natural resources rather than the grasslands of Zekok, which had very little other than animals and animal byproducts, which the state obviously wanted and needed, but not to the degree that they wanted oil, for instance, or whatever it was they were mining out there. So I do think it contributed, but I think it wasn't the sole reason it got so bad.
Great, thank you. So we have one person who's asked a couple of different questions, which kind of come back to maybe some of the more central themes in your talk. So one is, can you clarify what integration into the nation meant initially? How did it allow for the preservation of ethnic identity and culture? And then same person, so I'll just ask them both. How did the United Front initially sort of approach Tibetan Buddhism in comparison to how it viewed Islam?
Yeah, thanks. So integration means something, well, it's not spelled out, of course, but essentially what they want eventually is to create a socialist new man or something like that, to borrow a term from the Soviet Union. But they realize that that's going to take a long, long time. And the idea was that we can't force it, right? We've actually, I don't think they say that in my documents, but I think it's pretty clear they saw what happened in the Soviet Union in the 1930s and didn't want a repeat of that. We know from, I think, Inner Mongolia that people were talking about this, I believe. So integration really was creating a nation state of some sort, a nation where you don't have the same differences that you would have in an imperial formation, where political sort of cleavages aren't as pronounced. And so one of the things that people often critique China for, and maybe rightfully, is this idea of autonomy, autonomous areas and counties and prefectures. And they rightfully point out that there was never any real chance for true autonomy. And there, again, that's correct. But what it misses the point of, I think, is that it never was intended to provide independent or autonomous areas. It was intended to be a mechanism of integration, of transformation, by giving Tibetans and Mongols and others autonomy as they defined it within their little areas. They would become, quote unquote, masters of their own homes. And through this process, they would begin to understand again the benefits of the modern economy, of socialism, of integration, in the sense of becoming one with the rest of China. Obviously, that didn't happen. Could it have happened? You know, it's a little bit difficult to imagine the scenario where it does, right? But certainly, what I argue is that they're trying to find creative ways to transform an imperial possession into a nation state, and this is the way they came up with, and that's what integration meant, I think, to them. Buddhism's and Islam, for that matter, is an interesting topic. It's very clear that they were hostile to both religions, but they also understood, and they did so in a very patronizing way, that it was central to the identities and belief systems of these people, and therefore to attack it would be detrimental to the party's project, right? So I think Zhou Renshan says very early on, this United Front director, we don't want to win a battle and lose the war. In other words, we don't want to attack a monastery, not literally attack, but to go in there and try to reform it if it's going to then turn the Tibetan masses against us. So there's no doubt they thought that Tibetan culture and religion was backward in the way they understood it. I mean, they thought religion in general was backward and exploitative, right? But particularly, I think, in these areas. But they also believed in a very sort of patronizing, patrimonial way that in order to bring these sort of backwards people into modernity, they needed to live with this for the time being until they themselves came to understand the exploitative system that was in place. You know, and at different times, you know, the treatment of culture varied. In 1961, I think it is again, Yuan, this governor says, in response to attacks on Tibetan culture and Islamic culture, or more broadly, what's the big deal if we let Tibetan women have a bunch of braids? What's the big deal if Muslims want to wear long robes as long as they're not too hot? Is that bad for socialism? And obviously the answer is hopefully no. So I think that the attitude towards these things went back and forth, but clearly they always thought that religious believers were wrong and backwards, and hopefully someday that they would jettison these belief systems. And the only real difference I see between their treatment of Islam and Buddhism in this area, at least if I'm going to respond kind of quickly, is that because of the Ma regime that had been in place in this area, they thought that Muslims would be quite protective, or the Muslims would be less willing to accept the Han, that they would consider the Han to be a conquering force, while they thought that Tibetans would consider them to be a liberating force. And that's the way they approached the two peoples to a degree.
Great, thanks. One question that that maybe follows this a little bit more detail. So John Toden writes, in your book, one of the most striking problems facing the colonizing state seems to have been access to the population, or maybe, you know, lack of access to the population. And they tried to solve that by courting elites. I was unclear if the state had the capacity to contact and control pastoral peoples, or if it was an ideological choice. Or more clearly, was the United Front approach made necessary by the situation on the ground? Did greater state capacity in 1958-59 mean that the practical problem was less of an obstacle?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and sort of a chicken and egg question. And I think it goes back to my contention that these weren't the plans from the beginning, but the revolutionary patience took hold. They did not have the capacity to rule, I don't think, Amdo in a sort of as part of a consolidated state in the early years. They were certainly stretched way too thin across China, much less in border regions. They didn't have people that spoke Tibetan. They probably didn't have, you know, I mean, could they have gone in these places with guns a-blazing? Maybe. So state capacity was absolutely a problem. And the United Front was part of the way to deal with that. You know, we get access to these people through the mediation of local elites, as I've talked about. But that doesn't mean that at the same time, that doesn't mean that it was a cynical sort of ruse. I think you can't go back to these documents and have any sort of conclusion, or at least I haven't, maybe someone else can, that this was that they were doing this only because they had no other choice. They didn't have the capacity otherwise to deal with it. There's just no, you know, they never say this in the documents, and these are internal documents. They don't even hint at it. You know, they do suggest that that they have to sort of groom religious elites, for instance, because if we don't, if we don't do that, people will join the uprisings in the early 1950s. But that's a little bit different than saying that they're only doing it because they don't have the capacity otherwise. Now, in 1958, they did have the capacity. Does that mean that that's why they did it? I don't think so either. I think they did it because the times had changed. I think the emphases had changed. We see the state doing similar things throughout China, and getting resistance in many areas of China for these new demands. You know, I guess I can probably just end right there, but just saying just because you have the capacity doesn't mean that you necessarily want to employ it, and vice versa.
Great, thanks. We have, oh, these questions keep changing. So a question from Eben. He says, you mentioned during your discussion of the language of Great Han chauvinism, the CCP acknowledging what it perceived as legitimate grievances that non-Han peoples had against the Han majority. I'm curious, in the context of AMDO, what some of these rightful grievances the CCP acknowledged were.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. They're not spelled out so much as sort of under the umbrella of exploitation. And it's not just the Han majority, it's really the state that supported the Han majority. And because it's the Communist Party, they say it was most acute during the Republican period under Chiang Kai-shek and Ma Bu-feng. So it's very much about, they acknowledge that there's a long history of this, but then they claim that it became most serious in the last couple of decades, and that's why we have, the main reason we have to go in there and liberate these people. But they talk about things like a lack of religious freedom. They talk about particularly the economic exploitation. So they talk a lot about Ma Bu-feng's attempts to, and this is again the leader of the Ma clique in the 1930s and 40s, his attempt to sort of monopolize the grassland production in animal products and how badly this hurt local people. They talk about how they manipulated these local elites to serve Ma and in turn exploit the local people. So it's done in more sort of jargony way than it is specifics. You can certainly go back to the Wencher Zuliao, for instance, these cultural and historical materials, and they'll talk about different incidents where Ma Bu-feng in particular, but others may have sent his armies in against the Golokwa, for instance, which I was reading just today, and the massacres that ensued. So it's sort of this type of argument. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Another question that may be difficult to answer, I'm not sure. Pam Logan says, what you've described as happening in AMDO sounds very similar to what happened in COM. Can you comment on the similarities and differences between the two regions?
I mean, not really. I think the policies were the same. I think based on what I've read in secondary sources, that the main difference was that different people were in power in Qinghai than they were in Sichuan, and they dealt with some of these issues differently. So, Mel Goldstein argues that against the express orders of Beijing in 1955, 1956, local leaders, prefectural and provincial leaders implemented socialist reforms and attacks on monasteries. Well, that didn't happen in Qinghai. And he also argues that in Tibet there was an attempt to do this and it was stopped, and that's why we see different historical trajectories in these different places. So from what I understand, this is more or less the policy across ethno-cultural borderlands among non-Han Chinese, but the way it's going to be implemented anywhere is going to differ based on the circumstances and the people involved. And I think it's actually a good thing to remember in general. We always talk about CCP ethnic policies or nationality policies, whether it's back then or today. And you have to remember that it changes from place to place. The way they implemented things in Inner Mongolia, for instance, based on some people's work I've read, is somewhat different than what we see in Qinghai. And one of the reasons is that in Inner Mongolia, there was actually Mongolian leadership, which we don't see in Qinghai and elsewhere.
Great, thank you. We've run on for some time. Let me just ask a couple more questions. I do want to clarify one thing. There was a question about Central Tibetan Archives, and my understanding is that that's not something you did. No. Is that right? Okay. And I think some of the questions refer more to issues of Central Tibet rather than the AMDO region. So I will leave those aside. There's one rather specific question. Did monasteries like Hor and Dorjet Zong continue to remain fairly active, especially amongst the pastoral communities during this period you've discussed? Yeah. I don't know if that's something you...
Actually, that leads to an interesting point, actually. They seem to have, but my documents, the archival sources talk very little about the monasteries. They're very interested in these local hereditary headmen, people like the leader of the Hor, Wagya, who was probably the most powerful person in this region and became the principal intermediary, united front intermediary between the state and the party and the local people. But they talk relatively little about the monasteries and religion in general. And the best guess I can make as to why is because in I think pastoral areas like this, the party didn't think that they were that important. They knew that places like Lebrun across the border in Gansu was extremely important. And we could talk about other monasteries as well. But I think the assumption in places like Zeku is they didn't have the same importance and the same authority as they did in other areas. And the real power holders in this area were the tribal leaders or the chieftains. But they do seem to have been active, and they certainly are attacked in 1958 quite immediately.
Okay, I lied. I said one question more, but I'm going to ask two. One is, clearly your book has just come out, but have there been any reactions, from Chinese students or Tibetan students or people who may have kind of gotten an early hold on this historical work?
I mean, I've gotten a lot of Tibetans who have been very excited about the book. If the question is about Tibetans in China, then I really couldn't say. And there has been no explicit negative reactions from either Chinese people, who for the most part are very supportive, or the state. And the state doesn't usually react, I don't think, the way that we might imagine. We often don't know if the party notices or cares. Whether or not I would be allowed back into China, I just couldn't say. You probably wouldn't know until you try to get a visa, for instance. And then they probably wouldn't reject the visa. They just wouldn't allow you to apply for it, from what I've been told by most people. It did make a list of the books that are most likely not to be translated into simplified Chinese, the Chinese script that they use in the mainland, which I thought was quite funny. I mean, it wasn't an official list; it was somebody's list. But no, the reaction has been pretty good. I haven't got any sort of vitriol from any sort of nationalist vitriol that some people that you might expect.
Great. And then the last maybe substantive question I'll pose before we wrap up is, how should we think about this period of time in relationship to, and you kind of alluded to this in your talk, but the current situation with Uyghurs, for example, how might we think these things together?
Well, first of all, I think the 1950s, when we talk about what the party could do or what China could do to, I'll use this word, integrate again or nation build again with Tibetans or Uyghurs, anyone or any other sort of minority population. I think really the 1950s was the moment where they had the best chance, right? That's the moment where sort of nationalist ideologies hadn't really developed many of these people. It's where you have policies that were in place, or at least in theory in place, if not fully implemented, that were more pluralistic, that acknowledge these historical grievances and these types of things. So I think we can look back at it and think of it as a lost opportunity, perhaps, if we're prone to think that there is a possibility of having some sort of multi-ethnic state in China, in which people have somewhat close to equal say and equal respect. So when we look at Xinjiang today, we can look at Xinjiang in the 1950s, and I think you can say a similar thing about it at that point as we're saying about Amdo today. If we look at Xinjiang today, or Tibet today for that matter, I think what we see is sort of an opposite approach, right? And I think some people in the leadership would argue, well, that's because it didn't work. We tried these pluralistic policies, and they not only did they fail, but they were wrong-headed. The argument that some people in the leadership and some scholars make is that we never should have pushed for autonomy. We never should have pushed for multinational, separate but equal, so to speak, if you want to use those terms. We should have talked about a melting pot all along. We should have talked about a single nation, not many different nations together under one state. And that was a mistake. We're paying for that mistake now. And that's why we need to put in policies like you see over the last 10 years in Xinjiang or Tibet or elsewhere. Now, I mean, I don't agree with that, of course. I mean, I think these policies are criminal. But I think that's the way that the state would understand it. And I think the connections you can make between the two are the sort of different ends of a continuum, so to speak. One was the most pluralistic that the party had ever been, and today might be the most ethno-nationalistic that it's been, the Cultural Revolution perhaps aside.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking so much time to talk to us about your book and answer so many questions. I want to tell everyone who's still here that, again, in the chat is the link and the code if you would like to buy a copy of the book. The code is there, 09 Flyer. You can also find it on our website. And I also want to announce the next event for THI. That will be Tuesday, October 27th at 6 p.m. We will have, it's called The History and Future of Tibet's First Khenmos, Jue Liang and Andrew Taylor in conversation with Pema Tso. And that will be a more of an informal kind of conversation rather than a webinar. But again, thank you so very much. And thank you everyone who tuned in and asked great questions.
Thank you.
All right, good night.